thalassemias. You can get hemoglobinopathies which are actually qualitative difficulties. You can get high fetal hemoglobin. And then if we divide them into, there are two types of distinct categories. The autosomal recessive are these three, where the parents are asymptomatic carriers. So they are not even aware that they are carrying the abnormal gene. On the other hand, you have the unstable hemoglobins, which gives rise to an abnormal protein, polycythemic variants or methemoglobinemia. These come as sporadic mutations in a family, or once the mutation is there in the family, the inheritance is in an autosomal dominant fashion. So clearly we have the common conditions and the uncommon conditions. So we well know this structure very well, but between the molecules, the two alphas and two betas, there are two contacts. So normally you don't have a contact between the two alphas and the two betas, but there is a very nice contact between the alpha 1 and the beta 1, which is more extensive, involving about 34 amino acids, and this is interlocked. So there is very little movement or scope of movement here. However, the other side, whereas the alpha 1 and beta 2, this involves only 19 mutations, and there's a normal sliding movement which takes place when the oxygen comes and binds and is released off. So this just tells you briefly about the primary structure. We know that very well. The secondary structure happens when the amino acids are linked by the hydrogen bonds. The tertiary structures, there are about 8 helices from A to H, and there are the interhelical region, and the quaternary structure where you have the heme and the protoporphyrin. So at the C terminal residue, we have certain residues which are important in solid bridges that characterize the unligated liganded molecule, and at the N terminal you have the residue valine, which is important for the 2,3 diphosphate phosphoglycerate interactions. Then we have the heme group, which is located in a crevice between the E and F helices, and you also have the specific residues, that is the F8 residue and the E7 residues. These two elements of histidine are extremely important, and that's where the protoporphyrin ring actually comes and binds. So we can understand that there are certain areas of contact between the chains and between the heme and the globin, which tend to contain invariant residues. So where you actually will not have any tolerance of mutations. Then the oxygen dissociation curve, we are all very aware of, that if in the adult hemoglobin, it very easily gives off oxygen, whereas the fetal hemoglobin has its inherent property where it gives off less oxygen. So any condition which gives rise to a decrease in pH can give rise to release of oxygen very easily, but the opposite happens if there is a high oxygen affinity. So we usually call it a shift to the right or a shift to the left. So I'll just give you the case histories. This was a 52-year-old man from Punjab, and he had history of recurrent jaundice and pruritus. In the relevant past history, he was diagnosed to be a beta thalassemia carrier, and he had a thalassemia major child, where the child required regular transfusion and still comes to the transfusion clinic. Now this particular father, he had a spleen of 8 centimeters and a liver of 6 centimeters, and his hemoglobin ranged from 17.3 to 18.3 gram% with a higher PCB. And the red cell indices, while like a thalassemia trait with hypochromic microcytosis, the serum bilirubin was on the higher side with 4.2 milligram%. And the total leukocyte count and the platelet counts were within normal range. So the patient was not a smoker, he lived in the plains, not at high altitude, he did not have any aquagenic pruritus, and the leukocyte alkaline phosphatase score was in the normal range. The ultrasound features were suggestive of portal hypertension, and the professional diagnosis because of this very high hemoglobin was polycythemia rubra vera. So the red cell mass was on the higher side, and the oxygen saturation showed that it was a good oxygen saturation. The peripheral blood smear examination and the bone marrow examinations were normal. And when we did the hemoglobin electrophoresis, we found that the index case showed a slower moving band between the adult hemoglobin and the fetal hemoglobin. And in addition, the hemoglobin A2 was higher. And then we realized that this father had undergone investigations in 1989 the sample had been sent to USA, and there was at that time, by doing the cellulose chromatography and the separation of the alpha and the beta chains, it was identified that there is a amino acid change which happened. So this particular hemoglobin had been reported as hemoglobin Chandigarh in 1989. So at that time we had no idea that this was actually a high oxygen affinity kind of hemoglobin, because the hemoglobin was less at that time, or was in the normal range. So what actually happens is that between the tense and the relaxed phases, so the hemoglobin molecule becomes in the relaxed phase when the oxygen is there, and requires this 2,3-DPG at that particular point. So usually these mutations, like in this particular case, was in the heterozygous kind of state. The polycythemic variants have been described till now. About 55 to 60 different types of hemoglobins have been described. Most of them are in the beta globin chain, and some of them are in the alpha globin chain. So usually the patients have moderate degree of polycythemia. The differential diagnosis is myeloproliferative disorders, and the clue is that the normal counts should put you towards the track of that probably it may be a hemoglobinopathy. So you have to exclude anyway secondary polycythemia. It's important to remember that no treatment is required, and there are innumerable reports in the literature that these patients actually undergo repeated phlebotomies because of the very high hemoglobin. So the polyfin 2 actually does not tell you that there is a difficulty, because of the fact that it's not able to tell you a functional problem like a high oxygen affinity will give you a low score, which happens in our case here. So the other variants which have been described at this particular position of the amino acid 94 have been described as high oxygen affinity. In our case, it just so happened that the high oxygen affinity was actually described at a later stage, which we published later as a late emergence of polycythemia in the hemoglobin Chandigarh. So the take-home messages are that the hemoglobins with high oxygen affinity have an inability to release oxygen to the tissues and an abnormal oxygen equilibria, giving rise to primary erythrocytosis and polycythemia. Patients, despite having a normal hemoglobin or increased hemoglobins, are actually anemic from a functional point of view, which is why they keep on, the stress remains actually. Pregnancy is a difficult problem in some cases, and uncommonly patients can present with thrombosis, and they're usually due to mutations in the 2 points which are important, and I showed them earlier. So the second case, this is a 4 years male. He presented with a moderate pallor at the age of 2 years. He had hepatosplenomegaly and quite severe anemia with 76 grams per liter. The indices were showing slight macrocytosis, and the RDW was very high, which shows that there's a lot of anisopoikilocytosis happening. So this is one of the representative smears, and it shows that there were many spherocytes on the smear, some target cells were there, and some polychromatophilic cells, and the reticulocyte count was high. So there were actually some unstable hemoglobin, kind of those Heinz bodies were there. Anyway, so initially actually when I saw the case, it had come to me for a hemoglobin HPLC, because the child had a hemolytic kind of picture, and I noticed that there is an abnormal peak, and this peak looked like what we commonly see over here as HBQ India. In addition, the HbA2 was on the higher side. So because of that, I gave it as a double heterozygosity for HBQ India with beta thalassemia trait. So the child went back, and then again he gets admitted after 2 years with again a hemolytic episode. So at this particular point of time, it seemed like there is a genotype-phenotype correlation, obviously, because the HPLC is not matching with the clinical phenotype of the patient. So we checked the parents, and the parents, to my surprise, were normal. So since they were normal, he couldn't actually be having HBQ India with beta thalassemia trait. So we looked at the hemoglobin electrophoresis at this point, and we found a slow-moving band, which is actually in between the hemoglobin D, S and D, and the hemoglobin E region. And this was quite less in amount, just about a very faint band was there. which matches with what we've seen as an unknown peak over here at about 14.2%. So usually when we see lower percentages, we think that it's an alpha chain variant, because usually we have 4 alphas normally, and if there's an alpha chain variant, it usually is in the range of about 20 to 25% or so. So at this particular time, we did the urine for hemosiderin. It was strongly positive. The tests for unstable hemoglobins were positive. We do the 2 tests for unstable hemoglobins. They were positive. And then I looked at the HPLC graphs very closely, and I found that the patient actually has both the peaks are a little different looking, meaning that this looks like, the first one looks like an inverted funnel, and actually HBQ India is a sharper peak from the bottom. And also the HbA2, you can see it looks a bit broad in our patient compared to how you should get in a double heterozygosity case with HBQ India and beta thalassemia trait. So this was in a retrospect, hindsight, that I noticed these changes or differences which were there. So at this time we also did the flow cytometry to exclude PNH. There was a slight decrease, but it was not really very specific. We also did the osmotic fragility test simply because we had seen spherocytes in the periphery. That again showed a slight increase in the beginning, but then not very characteristic of hereditary spherocytosis or anything like that. Then at this time we had done the multi-TOF experiment, and we found that the alpha chain was normal and the beta chain had shown a decrease by 16 daltons. And